Mike and David had been friends for nearly 40 years, since they first met as teenagers and soon found they shared a passion for fishing. Like most fishermen, they were always on the lookout for new and bountiful waters, and that's what drove them to agree to this trip. They chose this summer to explore deep into a seemingly abandoned forest in the hopes of finding a lost river on an ancient map that supposedly teemed with fish. What they found, however, was a true nightmare. The path was hard enough to follow on the way out, and before long it was overgrown and weedy. David got the lantern set up, and by the time he had had enough time to fashion a leak, startled the water snake out of the reeds. The sun was just sinking below the horizon. The shadows spread long fingers across the forest floor that seemed improbably spindly. The gear was set up in hurried haste, and we cast our lines as the sun dipped out of sight. The waters of the river were dark and as still as glass, the slate blue surface reflecting the blackening sky back at us. Not long after the line was in the water, that unnatural fog began to roll in. It smothered the area in a lethal frost that seemed to consume cold. It was thick enough to almost choke on, and it had the peculiar quality of making the lantern light look as if it were bleeding to black. Everything grew gray, and anything that made a sound seemed to pass through the fog without registering more than a thrumming vibration that set my teeth on edge. David wasn't the first one to notice something was wrong. He had the line he was fishing tug at hard from the get-go. Whatever it was significantly stronger than anything he'd ever hooked before. He kept a stiff line and launched back, using the bend in his rod to grind the line back in toward him. The line went taut and the rod began a seesaw arc that threatened to snap the thing off. I rushed over with my net and we began pulling our hard, each of us twisting the rod in our effort to hold on, and still the line was being drawn deeper into the water. Then the water began roiling, surface tension breaking and foamy bubbles rising and dissolving in the black current. The lashing ripples grew larger and larger still, and shadowy forms began to brush the surface of the water and slip from the fog into the light. They were human-looking, but for features that were distorted as if viewed through a sandstorm. Their mouths were broad and slack, their teeth on open display. Their eyes were sunken into their skulls, dark pinholes that shone with a deep inner glow. Both of us stood there and found that we could not look away. One of the shadowy things walked toward us, seeming to glide over the surface of the water without pushing it from its path. Skeletal fingers with blackened nails reached out and, without a sound, it touched David. In a flash, she was upon him, gripping David's wrist with freezing hands of icy grease. David called out in horror, trying to pull away, but the grip seemed supernatural. Mike grabbed hold of him and pulled back, but the creature was rooted in another dimension and would not yield. The mist thickened. The grip on David's shoulder loosened. Mike fell to the ground, choking and gasping. His hands trembled, and it took him nearly a minute to calm them. When the fog lifted, David was gone. Only an empty rod and the black abyss of the river remained. Searches were made. David's body was never found. Some of the locals repeated old tales of ancient spirits who lived in the river, but no one had set foot there for generations. Mike was left with the memory and the unsolved problems. At night, he'd dream about being drawn back to the river. He could never tell why, but the mists would never lift and the shadow creatures walked there free to go where they pleased. The years passed, and the river stayed the same, stubborn as memory. David's disappearance joined the list of stories about the rapids, cautionary yarns to scare off daredevils, dark myths to keep the hardy away. Mike stopped fishing, moved away from the woods. He never talked about that night, but the fear and remorse glinted blue in his eyes. The shadow was where the river ran, at the thin place between the world of men and the world of the spirits, in the dark dive where those waters met. The river kept its secrets. No one knew what had happened to him, down there, in the dungeon of the current, waiting for another soul, even braver or even stupider, to take the dive. Jackson liked night fishing because, at dusk, the still unruffled river offered a quiet departure from the din of the day. The gentle current lapping along the bank would never be the same after that evening. He cast his line and sat back, relishing the quiet. There was a soft sobbing. Jackson squinted in the darkness, but he could see nothing out of the ordinary. A peculiar feeling, like little pins at the edge of his awareness, crept in. He ignored it and turned his attention back to fishing. A minute later, his rod twitched erratically. He tugged it in, straining. But when the object came up, a smile lighting his face, it took a moment to recognize what it was. The featureless coffin of a human hand was hanging onto his hook. The dead appendage emerged from the water, waving and flailing about for a few seconds before vanishing back into the water. Jackson took a step back, his heart jackhammering, and the sobbing intensified, the whales having an edge of grief and rage to them now. The air crackled with something, some kind of unseen hostile power. Trying to get a grip, Jackson decided to leave. But then the wind turned bitter cold. Someone called his name in a soft, pleading voice. He realized it was the wind, only he turned anyway. A woman's ghostly form stood on the riverbank. Her face was twisted with anguish, a hand stretched out. Awestruck, Jackson began to back up. He'd heard rumors of the Weeping Widow, about how a child drowned here, and a woman rushed into the water to save her and drowned as well. Now her spirit wandered the river shore, trying to pull drowning victims under with her. A cold hand closed around Jackson's ankle. He looked down and saw bony ghost fingers scrabbling up through the mud trying to pull him in. Jackson kicked, heaved himself to his feet, and ran, without looking back, as the Weeping Widow's mournful wail echoed in the night. Back in the protection of his car, Jackson's mind buzzed. He'd always thought stories of malevolent spirits were just that, stories. But out there, tonight, he'd come face to face with a force he could neither see nor understand. Some legends, it seems, are born of terrible fears. Jackson never talked about that night, but after the incident he stopped making his midnight visits to the river. It seemed he cut himself vainly on the scourge of the river, eternally charged with light, ever forming and reforming the rugged outline of some unsleeping scarecrow ghost that, invisible, seemed stalking him along its bed, haunting its holy waters. The river had its own secrets, but Jackson found out the hard way some things are best left alone. The moon hung low and full over the riverbank, turning the ruffled water into liquid glass. The air smelled moldy with the smell of wet earth and composting leaves. This was the time of year when the ghost story was told. Rumors were exchanged and deaths were remembered. On November 20th, 1908, at just before 8 p.m., Kate Seymour, a blind old spinster in her 50s, stepped into the river and took her life, drowning herself near the south pier of Beccles Railway Bridge on the Norfolk-Suffolk border. Witnesses recalled seeing him walking into the east window of the Beccles River Hotel, but why? Why would the fragile woman, who lived alone in her aunt's cottage just a few minutes away, and who was connected to a tight-knit group of blind friends and neighbors, do something so extreme, walking into the water up to her neck and offering no resistance to those who reached out to save her, without a note or any explanation? Seymour's overpowering despair had finally overwhelmed her. Jacob and his friends had heard the stories many times before, but never gave them much credence. Stories were stories, legends were legends. But that night the quiet of the woods seemed to wrap around them like a shroud as they gathered themselves around a fire set by the river. It wasn't long after they settled in that they began to see a distant figure that was slowly materializing in the mist ahead of them. Without speaking, the boys exchanged uneasy glances. It looked like another hiker, but the man's gnarled face and vacant eyes put them on edge. He wore an old, torn and ragged coat, with a bent fishing rod hanging from his left hand. He stalked toward the water, casting his line into the dark river. The friends stared for a long moment, trying to pacify their growing fear, but one of them, Jacob, too curious to be cautious, stepped forward. "Catch anything out there?" the boy asked the old stranger. The fisherman turned his head slowly towards Jacob, his dull, cow-eye locks snapping into focus. Hardly able to make out the man's features, Jacob paused, allowing his eyes to adjust to the gloom. When they did, Jacob was shocked to see that the fisherman's mouth had moved, but no words had emerged. Later, he would recall that strange incident for his academic papers. His voice hoarse, the old man muttered something indecipherable and then turned away from the fire, stepping into the mist that swirled about him, his form fading as it vanished into the night. That night, all the friends tried to settle down to sleep. but the snap of leaves or the splash of water in the river sent their hearts racing. Jacob dreamt that he floated face down in the river, tangled among the reeds at the shallows. The fisherman stood over him, his razored eyes peering down from underneath his wide-brimmed hat. "Help me find it," he said. Jacob woke up, his heart hammering and his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. When he looked over at his friends, they were tossing and turning too, their voices and their nightmares eerily similar to his own. As soon as they were awake, they grabbed what belongings they could and fled. But as they were loading their equipment into the pickup truck, Jacob saw something shining in the light of the moon near the water's edge. He walked over and picked it up. It was one of those old, rusted fishing lures. As soon as he touched it, he felt a cold prickle of fear run down his spine and was able to make out the faint whisper of the fisherman's voice. "Come back. I need your help." He ran to the pickup and they sped away. But when they glanced back, the line that was tied around Jacob's fish-shaped lure was far from being broken as the fishermen stood where their campfire had been, his eyes glistening in the dark. The legend was no longer just a set of words or story to them. It had been transformed into a genuine nightmare. After that evening by the river, the friends never spoke of it again. Their lives went on as usual, save for a few occasions when Jacob found a discarded old fishing lure on his doorstep, a reminder that the ghost fishermen still lingered about the banks of the river. Alex, Jake, and Ryan set out on the Amazon River in search of the fish of a lifetime. As they motored out to the outer sloughs, their boat's inboard motors sputtered out. Their engine died. The guys anchored down and planned to raise the old carburetor in the morning. As dusk fell, the men on the river heard talking and splashing, as it seemed, from the water. They said it was probably just wildlife. Soon, however, their joking and chatter stopped. Silence fell on the river. During the wee hours of the morning, Alex woke up to see a strange glowing light around the boat. Stooping figures were circling the boat 5 to 10 feet below the surface. His father has later told him, their eyes burning like lanterns. They rose from the water, their torsos deforming as if there was flesh growing in their backs. Alex was screaming as Jake and Ryan woke up. The creatures had surrounded the boat. The fishermen tried to get away on their feet, but their legs were rooted to the spot with terror. The creatures pulled the men underwater. The morning after, a rescue team found the empty boat, engines still in good condition. No bodies were found, and the legend of El Arrastre del Rio, the river's grasp, spread quickly among the local fishermen's waves. Decades passed, and one last fisherman was said to have glimpsed the three men, their eyes lighting up like lanterns, and they had been swept away forever by the river that circled the city of gold. The mist came thick and stinking on the water, and Roger threw his line into the filthy river. It was an autumn evening, cold, and the line in the murky river waters disappeared into dense forest on this side of the bank and the other. Roger loved to fish on his own, but tonight it was different. Back in his camping chair, he felt a tickle, an uncomfortable chill that seemed to travel through his core. Roger shook. He pulled his jacket tighter around him. Then suddenly, the waters began to rip. Roger looked up. From the depths of the river, a light appeared, a glowing ethereal form that slowly began to rise. The creature's hollow eyes turned in his direction with a furious intensity. Its pale face trembled, its lips stretched in a macabre grin. It floated closer, its dress whipping in the water like smoke. Roger's heart was beating so hard, yet strangely he felt paralyzed with horror. He picked up his fishing rod and sat, frozen. He had to pull his line, yet for some reason a deep instinct took over. No, he wanted to pull away, but he did not hesitate. He yanked his rod, testing his weight. Gradually, he reeled in his line, his hands shaking with anxiety. When at last something crashed through the water's surface, Roger gasped. Snagged upon his line was a rotted old doll, its eyes gouged out and the joints deformed beyond recognition. Air began to feel colder, and something was uttering an odd whispering. The enraged spirit let out a scream that sounded like a death howl, startling the birds. In a tailspin of terror, Roger stumbled backwards and fell into the dirt. He could not make camp here. It was too unnerving. He had to leave right away. With shaking hands, he began to gather his things. The whispering grew louder and more frantic, unseen hands shoving at his back. He picked up his cooler and felt a powerful shove, almost knocking him into the river. All he could do was lurch for his car, panting and gasping for air. He jumped in without looking behind him. All he saw through his foggy windshield was the spirit standing up at the riverbank, those hollow eyes turned towards him. Unawares, Roger had locked himself into a dark history. Years prior, a little girl named Eleanor had drowned in the river. Once having learned of her death, her distraught mother vowed that anyone who dared to seek solace in the waters would never find peace. Ever since, it was whispered amongst the locals that the spirit of Eleanor's mother still dwelled by the river, exacting revenge upon any soul who dared to disturb her lingering grief. The cursed spirit of Eleanor's mother reared her head up alongside him. I watched as the ghost crossed the river and told me so many things. He was one of the very first, and possibly the luckiest. Although his body was unharmed, Roger soon began to suffer a terrible affliction. Every time he closed his eyes, he could see those hollow eyes staring back at him. He began to hear that ghost-like voice, echoing the words, "This is where I part from the living world." Years later, Roger could still describe the sound of those whispered words reaching his ears. These days, when insomnia strikes, it happens all over again. In the dead of night, Roger still wakes to find himself bathed in a sweat and struggling to silence the frantic screams of the cursed spirit, calling him back to the riverbank. "One last time," it implores, "one last time, and you will find me." Subsequently, Roger never returned to that river. The imprint of the evil spirit was too firmly etched in his mind. It had become a symbol of the pestilence of that place where the living dare to walk. The river was not a place for communing with nature, but for dealing with demons where the barrier between life and death is very thin.